Hello, and welcome to this live stream. I'm very happy you've joined me today. We've got a lot to cover, and I'm going to do my best to cover this quickly but thoroughly. So let's get right to it. You may have heard that the founder of the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, called himself Lucifer and held very anti-Christian beliefs. That's true. But too many people out there take that one idea and plug it into their understanding of Christianity and Scientology and think Hubbard was Satan and that Scientology is somehow satanic. L. Ron Hubbard's own son said that, and I'm sorry, but he was wrong. Scientology is not Satanism. There's a deeper set of ideas swimming around, and today we're going to go over these and go as deep into Hubbard's beliefs as we did when we covered his personal writings called the Affirmations. If you haven't seen those videos, I'd encourage you to do so, since those cover the ideas and beliefs that Hubbard had when he first conceived and wrote Dianetics and then Scientology. But today we're jumping forward to the 1980s, and we're going to look at Hubbard's beliefs at the end of his life. These were woven into Scientology, as you'll see, and Hubbard wanted to pass these on to all Scientologists when he wrote what is called the OT VIII Student Briefing. OT VIII is the highest level of Scientology's indoctrination levels. It takes years of dedicated effort and easily $1 million in donations to rise through all the ranks and jump through all the hoops so that they will give you this level, which they have ironically labeled Truth Revealed. OT VIII is supposed to be the final resolution of amnesia on the whole track, meaning that after you do this level, you are supposed to be able to remember literally everything that has ever happened to you as a spiritual being, going back literally quadrillions of years into the past. If you're familiar with Scientology, then you know already that Scientology believes in past lives, and that we have been kicking around in this physical universe, not just on planet Earth, but this entire universe, for much, much longer than science here on Earth says is possible. The purpose of this video is not to cover all of that, but to actually focus in on a single bulletin, about 3 pages long, where Hubbard says stuff that isn't anywhere else in Scientology. It's wild and crazy material, but there is a rhyme and reason to it. Hubbard had very specific beliefs and ideas, and if you want to know what those were, then you've come to the right place. I'm not going to bore you with the details of how this material was leaked into the public domain, but this has been verified as authentic by people who did the original version of OT VIII back when it was first released in 1988. Because of the negative backlash by Scientologists who read this material, and the fact it drove some of them a bit nuts, David Miscavige pulled this document out of OT VIII, and it's no longer part of the level. But it's far too interesting and informative to ignore. Like Hubbard's Affirmations, this document gives us insight into Hubbard in a way that few other things can. Before we dive into that bulletin, there is something we need to cover first to give you the proper context for what Hubbard's talking about. That is a subject called Gnosticism. Perhaps you've heard this word before, or maybe not. It's a little esoteric because it's a word that describes a lot of different belief systems, kind of like Christianity describes a lot of different denominations or groups which only share a few common points of belief. In Christianity, there's always a belief that Jesus is the divine Son of God, whose death and resurrection provide forgiveness and eternal life, and that salvation comes through faith in him. Yet, look at the wide variety of Christian denominations all over the world and how many differences there can be from one group to another. It's the same with Gnosticism. It's an umbrella label that scholars use to describe a wide variety of ancient spiritual movements, mostly from the first few centuries after Jesus, that shared some core ideas about God, creation, and our true nature. But let me stress right now that these are not ancient ideas that died off once Christianity took off. There are modern religions that have millions of members that are steeped in Gnostic ideas. Religions like Mormonism and Scientology. These beliefs didn't go anywhere. If you understand Scientology, much of this is going to sound very familiar to you. So, what did Gnostics actually believe? 1, the material world is a mistake, or even evil. Most Gnostic systems said the physical world we live in is deeply flawed, corrupt, or even a prison for the soul. It wasn't created by the highest God, but by a lower, ignorant being, often called the demiurge. This being is sometimes linked to the angry God of the Old Testament. So you can see how this would clash with mainstream Judaism and Christianity, which view creation as fundamentally good. 2, there's a hidden ultimate God. Above that lower creator, there's a remote, unknowable, utterly pure God, sometimes called the monad. From this ultimate source came a series of spiritual beings called eons that populate a divine realm known as the pleroma. One of these beings, named Sophia, which means wisdom, often plays a role in accidentally unleashing the demiurge, who then creates our flawed universe. 3, humans carry a divine spark. Despite living in this flawed material world, humans, or at least some humans, have a spark of the divine trapped inside them. It's like a tiny piece of the true God that fell into matter and forgot where it came from. 4, salvation comes through gnosis, secret knowledge. Gnosticism, as a word, comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. But it's not book smarts. It's mystical, direct insight into spiritual truths. Salvation isn't about having faith in a resurrection or obeying religious laws. It's about waking up, realizing who you really are, and escaping the material world to return to the spiritual realm. 5, Jesus as a revealer, not a savior on the cross. In many Gnostic texts, Jesus isn't primarily about dying for sins. Instead, he's a divine emissary who came to reveal hidden truths, to spark that awakening. Some Gnostic writings even say his crucifixion was an illusion or symbolic, because for them, it was all about inner enlightenment, not bodily sacrifice. Let me give you some flavor from their own writings. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says, quote, "When you make the two one, and when you make the inner as the outer, then you will enter the kingdom." That's classic mystical language about finding unity and discovering your true divine nature. The second treatise of the great Seth has Jesus laughing at his crucifiers, basically mocking the idea that they could kill him because the real Christ is beyond matter. In On the Origin of the World, you get a wild retelling of Genesis. The arrogant demiurge creates the world thinking he's the only God, and Sophia and Eve work behind the scenes to awaken humanity to higher truths. Bart Ehrman, who's written extensively on this, says Gnosticism is best understood as a broad spiritual tendency that's centered on two things: a negative view of the material world, seeing it as something to escape, and the belief that secret knowledge was the key to salvation, not faith or church rituals. So, in summary, Gnosticism is a diverse set of ancient belief systems that taught our world was created by a lesser God, that humans carry a divine spark trapped in flesh, and that salvation comes through discovering secret spiritual knowledge so we can awaken and return to the ultimate divine source. Now, just like Hubbard took Aleister Crowley's writings and interpreted it in his own unique way and weaved his ideas into Scientology, so too does Hubbard take these Gnostic ideas and weave them into his briefing on OT VIII. So let's get into it. We're just going to start at the top of this student briefing and go over it point by point. Here we go. By the time you read this, I will no longer be occupying the body and identity that you have known as Ron. That identity continues to live in the hearts and minds of many, as well as in on-source tech and admin centers around the planet, and will inspire for years to come Scientologists and lovers of truth everywhere. All right, now I will have some commentary as we go. Lovers of truth is such a funny twist of phrase here, and of course the irony of that is palpable given the objective fact that L. Ron Hubbard was a compulsive and pathological liar. He was incapable of understanding any truth but his own, which is why he declared himself source with a capital S to Scientologists and wrote Keeping Scientology Working many years before. The meaning was clear. Only L. Ron Hubbard could parse out the truth from the lies of our existence, and therefore only he could be the source of truth. This is something every single authoritarian personality feeds his followers, and one of the single biggest mistakes that human beings fall for. We decide that this one person, this one genius or guru or whoever, is the only one who can dispense truth and wisdom to us. We're always fools to fall for it, but there has not ever been one society or culture that hasn't done it many times. The exceptions aren't just few and far between, they literally don't exist. This is the classic argument of every strongman who has ever taken control and then rained abuse down on his followers and told them it was what they deserved. All right, let's continue with Hubbard. What follows is a story that has been withheld for reasons which will soon be obvious until such time as there were enough OTs that something could be done about it. That time is now. It is not a nice or a pretty story, but I trust that having arrived on the OT VIII course, you are ready to hear it. You have undoubtedly heard pieces of data over the years that hinted at the greater untold reality of my mission here on Earth. But the story was never written nor spoken in its entirety due to security problems that have unfortunately always plagued the organization. It is only now that I feel it's safe to release the information, although the time is rapidly approaching when I will have no choice in the matter. The hour draws that near. All right. Now, something you may not know, but after the FBI raid in 1977, and with Hubbard's mental faculties on the decline, according to testimonials and documentation from his former inner circle staff, Hubbard's already paranoid rantings about Scientology being infiltrated by the FBI or other government agencies went into full-blown overdrive. I can't share them with you because they've not leaked out on the internet for me to find, but Hubbard wrote orders for the Los Angeles Church of Scientology in the early 1980s, specifically stating that Los Angeles was the most criminal city on the planet, and that LA Org had been infiltrated by FBI agents and a massive cleaning house was in order. It was exactly this kind of paranoia about his own people, pretty classic dictator stuff, which enabled David Miscavige to carry out his internal witch hunts and eventually get rid of anyone who was deemed a threat to Hubbard and eventually to Miscavige himself. Of course, this was after years of Hubbard believing he had been betrayed by supposedly disloyal people, meaning those who finally saw Hubbard for what he really was and were sick of his abuses, including, by the way, his own children. These are the kinds of things Hubbard is referring to when he admits that so-called security problems had always been plaguing the organization. I'm not going to delve too deeply into specifics, as people have a tendency to bog themselves down in significance, which would only serve to delay the immediacy of the task at hand. Therefore, I will be brief. Some 80-odd million years ago, Earth time, it actually dates at 78,395,042, but dates are a bit superfluous with this material, plans were drawn by a group outside the messed universe for the eventual takeover of a good portion of this universe. Okay, now to be clear, whoever this group outside the messed universe is, this is not in reference to Xenu or the Galactic Confederacy or even the invader forces which Hubbard had talked about in his earlier space opera fantasies. As far as I know, this is the first and only time that Hubbard makes reference to beings living outside of our material world. He doesn't name them, so in this video, let's just call them the outsiders. In 1952, Hubbard wrote a book titled A History of Man, which I recently called the most ridiculous book Hubbard ever wrote. In that book, he makes mention of a separation from the main body of Theta into a home universe, which he defined as a universe of the Thetans' own creation. At some point, Thetans got together and started sharing their individual playgrounds, and that's where the messed universe that we all live in now actually comes from. So you can already see the Gnostic ideas at work in Hubbard's mind. Not a particularly large nor imaginative crew, their exterior perspective, however, gives them considerable advantage over the time-bound beings of the messed universe. Okay, so that's a little bit more of the bulletin there. Now, if you have a logical brain, and I like to think I do, this is where even Hubbard's drivel doesn't make any sense within its own convoluted logic. Hubbard talks endlessly about how the goal of Scientology is to create operating Thetans who are, quote, knowing and willing cause over matter, energy, space, and time. He says that time is only a thing within this physical universe, and he defines it as a measure in the rate of change of objects in this universe. But you know what he never talks about? Time travel. Not once in all his materials does he ever go into time travel. Yet ultimately, a Thetan is supposed to rise to a position of being able to levitate or create or destroy any kind of matter or energy at will. And he even alludes to being able to collapse or create empty space. But he never went into any kind of time travel. For whatever reason, Hubbard's mind just locked up on that topic. Probably because he realized as a science fiction writer how convoluted and nuts it can get when you start messing with time streams and the concept of cause and effect. Hubbard pretended to be a deeply philosophic man, but he wasn't a deep thinker. I'm pretty sure the Terminator movies would have sent his little mind over the edge trying to figure out the logic holes that time travel stories very easily create. So he avoided any reference to any of that, at least within my experience of Scientology. Yet here he says the outsiders have an advantage over the time-bound beings of the messed universe. And it's right there that this whole narrative collapses in a huge logical hole. If the outsiders operate independently of our time stream, and by definition they would, then they can create or alter events at any point in time just as easily as any other point in time. They don't have to implement an event in the year 0 and then wait patiently 2,000 years to see what happens. They know already what will happen because to them, all time is one time. One of the best science fiction stories that embraced this idea as a key plot point was a movie called Arrival, made in 2016. Aliens land on Earth and start communicating with us, and it takes quite some time to realize that these aliens have a time perception that is radically different from ours. Put simply, we experience life as a continuous river of cause and effect. Our perception of reality forces us to experience time in a linear fashion. Yet, at least at the level of a thought experiment like this movie, you could pose the idea that a race of beings who experience time completely differently exist. They're aware of all things in their vicinity all at once across all of time. What happened 50 years ago is something that is just as real and just as perceivable for them as something happening right now, or something happening 500 years from now. So if you take that simple idea of time perception and you apply it to what Hubbard insists is reality, then time is not any kind of barrier or limitation for the outsiders. All time is the same time to them. Now, this begs many questions, such as why they would care one iota about anything going on in this universe in the first place. I'll just drop this spoiler right here that Hubbard never answers that question or gives any real motivation for the outsiders other than an implication that they're some kind of control freaks, or maybe they're playing some kind of game and we are the game pieces. That would fit in with Hubbard's dogma, but it doesn't really acknowledge this paradoxical time issue, so I personally doubt that he gave it a moment's notice. Again, Hubbard was not a deep thinker. He was the source of truth, and as far as he was concerned, the truths he doled out to his followers were simply to be accepted without question or skepticism. If the outsiders truly are outside time, there is not one thing that anyone in this entire universe could do from inside it to alter or change or stop them from doing whatever they want, whenever and however they want. The time factor is that powerful. Just think about it, and I'm sure you'll see what I mean. Now, putting that aside and having already totally debunked everything else that Hubbard has to say here, let's move on as if we didn't just do that and see what other ridiculous nonsense he has to throw at his OT VIII followers. So he goes on. Quote, borrowing from earlier operations such as Helitrobus, they conceived an ongoing implant, some portions of which have been fairly faithfully rendered in parts of the Bible. Okay, now let's take another break here. Let's talk briefly about implants, and one very specific one that features how Hubbard thought about Christianity. Simply put, an implant is a kind of hypnotic command that lasts beyond just one life, because it's the thetan, the spirit, who is getting hypnotized, not the body. Both during and between lives, Hubbard asserted that thetans were picked up and forced through various kinds of powerful electronics to submit to being tossed around, confused, electrocuted, and other kinds of painful atrocities committed against them so they could then be ordered what to do. Hubbard spent a lot of time describing in minute detail what these implants consisted of, and he said that the only thing that could detect and undo them was high-level Scientology auditing. All of the OT II level, the one you do right before you find out about Xenu, is about addressing some of these implants. Basically, if you imagine that the Ghostbusters not only captured ghosts with their proton packs, but then knocked those ghosts out and implanted powerful commands into their little ghost heads, then you have a pretty spot-on idea of what Hubbard was suggesting. Now, helitrobus refers to a series of implants carried out by what Hubbard described as a pipsqueak government on this planet of helitrobus. The specifics of their implants aren't really that important here, but the fact that they engaged in a series of implants, doing it over and over and over again, so the commands would really be burned in, is more the point for today. Now, we think of heaven as this eternal place outside of the material world, or some supernatural place where God lives and we would get to go be with him forever. Well, in the May of 1963, Hubbard wrote that that is all a lie, a direct effort to control our behavior and our thinking and our beliefs, and not just here on Earth. No, Hubbard said this repeating series of implants were done to us starting 43 trillion years ago and affected this whole sector of the universe. This was all long before Xenu came around. Now, we don't need to get into all the gory details of the heaven implants, but I can summarize it basically by telling you that Thetans were captured and put through this elaborate region up in the mountains that had pearly gates and statues of angels and other religious icons. And there was also a bistro and a trolley bus and other stuff. Hubbard compares it to Busch Gardens in Pasadena. This place was apparently in use for so long that it fell into disarray, so Thetans would be put through it multiple times and get all these very weird, confused ideas about heaven and hell, too. The details are, again, not super important, but let me share what Hubbard said his takeaway was from this, because that is important. We have our hands on an appalling piece of technology where the world is concerned. With rapidity and a meter, it can be shown that heaven is a false dream, and that the old religion, Christianity, was based on a very painful lie, a cynical betrayal. What does this do to any religious nature of Scientology? It strengthens it. New religions always overthrow the false gods of the old. They do something to strengthen man. We can improve man. We can show the old gods false, and we can open up the universe as a happier place in which a spirit may dwell. What more can you expect? This actually places us far beyond any other beings that are about. It puts us, through increased beingness and a restoration of life, in control of much destiny. We have now only a few unsolved problems about life, huge though they may be, such as the construction of bodies and how does one establish the character of and communicate, if feasible, with beings who are making trees and insects. There are a few things like these. But I imagine when we finally manage to communicate with beetles under rocks and free them, we'll no doubt find the creator of heaven who 43+ trillion years ago designed and built the pearly gates and entrapped us all. Good Lord, I'd hate to be guilty of that overt. But never mind, you aren't either. That guy is gone, I hope. And that's what L. Ron Hubbard said in a bulletin on May 11th, 1963, called Heaven. Also, and this is important, Hubbard made it crystal clear that this heaven implant is not a metaphor, but an objectively real, scientifically discovered event which he found using the e-meter and which he expected Scientologists to be able to verify the same way. There's one more thing I want to share with you about Hubbard's take on implants in Christian beliefs. Hubbard refers to something called R6, which is just another term for the reactive mind, which is the storehouse of all your collected trauma and abuse over the centuries. In 1968, Hubbard made very clear and bold claims in a lecture called Assists. Here's what he said. Quote, "The entirety of Roman Catholicism, the devil, all of this sort of thing, that is all part of R6. the Roman Catholic Church, somewhere along the line, through watching the dramatizations of people, picked up some little fragments of R6, and they make it look like it's continued forward into present time. Anyway, every man is then shown to have been crucified, so don't think that it's an accident that this crucifixion, they found out that this applied. Somebody somewhere on this planet, back around 600 BC, found some pieces of R6, and I don't know how they found it, either by watching Mad Men or something, but since that time, they have used it, and it became what is known as Christianity. The man on the cross. There was no Christ, but the man on the cross is shown as every man. So of course, each person seeing a crucified man has an immediate feeling of sympathy for this man. Therefore, you get many pre-clears who say they are Christ. Now, there's two reasons for that. One is the Roman Empire was prone to crucify people, so a person can have been crucified. But in R6, he is shown as crucified. All right, I kind of think that speaks for itself. So let's go ahead and jump back to the OT VIII briefing. Hubbard says that the outsiders have embedded a really powerful implant in all of us. He says this happened as part of the OT III Xenu incident, but it was a separate thing from what Xenu and his renegades were doing to us. See, Hubbard is changing up the Xenu narrative now. If you dive into the details of Hubbard's various ramblings about what Xenu was doing, you come to the point where he says that it was about solving overpopulation. So not only did Xenu wipe out trillions upon trillions of bodies, but he then entrapped the Thetans and spent 36 days implanting them with ideas about religion and how bodies age and die, and with all kinds of obsessions about sex, so that when these Thetans started running bodies again, they'd be so worked up about sex and procreation that there would be all these weird traumas and obsessions about it. And this was Xenu's big master plan to get people to stop making babies, apparently. I mean, these are the ramblings of a man who was seriously screwed up on sex in a lot of ways. So this whole thing, from one sense, is just another way that Hubbard was projecting his obsessions and disabilities onto everyone. But then, much later on with this student briefing, Hubbard decides to add the outsiders. And he says they were watching when Xenu was executing his genocide, and they created some kind of genetic mutation at this same time. Now, there are a lot of reasons why this is absolutely illogical gibberish that simply can't fit in at all with OT III. But perhaps the biggest reason of all is that after these 36 days of implanting, Xenu shot all these implanted Thetans back out into space. So what happened here on Earth, which was now a radioactive wasteland after all these atomic weapons had been used to blow up volcanoes and kill everyone? Well, absolutely nothing happened here. There was no life of any meaningful use to anyone for millions and millions of years. In fact, in that assists lecture, Hubbard specifically said that this part of the universe was a very unsavory, uninviting place to the rest of the universe because of what Xenu had done here. It wasn't until relatively modern times, about 20 million years ago, when he said a body line started up again. And that's where all of modern evolution, as we understand it, begins. So what genetic mutation are these outsiders creating in what bodies? There were no bodies around for them to introduce any mutation into. Logic holes like this, just like with the time thing we talked about earlier, are big enough to drive a Mack truck through. But Hubbard's delusions clearly don't care about logic. So we have to set that aside and somehow accept that this genetic mutation is a real thing, just like we had to accept that Emperor Palpatine came back in the final Star Wars movie with absolutely no logical explanation as to how or why that possibly could have happened. All right, so here's how Hubbard describes it in the bulletin. Quote, "This implant, laid in by carefully controlled genetic mutation at incident 2 of OT III and periodically reinforced by controlled historic events since then, makes it effectively impossible for beings on the more heavily affected planets, such as Earth, to become free. It causes progressive genetic evolution that gives the subject population greater and greater susceptibility to the telepathic impingement and direction of the controllers. In its final stage, the progression becomes almost geometric, and it is this final stage that we are rapidly approaching." Okay, now, the real point of this, of course, is that Hubbard is trying to get his followers to believe that the very DNA of their bodies contains some alien mutation which enables the outsiders to control them telepathically. I mean, talk about setting someone up to have a paranoid-induced psychotic episode. I mean, imagine for a moment that the man you have looked upon for years, probably decades, in order to get to OT VIII, now tells you, surprise, it's not just your reactive mind and the thousands of body thetans that you had working against you, but now there's this unseeable, untouchable, and unstoppable force that has been part of this picture the entire time, who are actually the puppet masters behind everything. Don't you feel enlightened now? I mean, you know, and to really pour it on, he then says that in this current age, we're on a timetable to be invaded. And the telepathic control factor is going to go into overdrive. Put another way, this is Hubbard announcing that we are rapidly approaching end times. Quote, "Another aspect of this GE line implant is that the body becomes, in effect, a sort of theta trap that kicks in heavily on the being should he attempt to expand his horizons beyond that of pure physical universe reality. There can be temporary key outs, which we have all experienced in varying degrees, but until this area is handled, it can honestly be said that there is no hope for continued expansion. The good news is that once this is run out, expansion becomes rather effortless and almost automatic." Okay, so this paragraph has only one point to make. It doesn't matter that you are all the way up to OT VIII, and it doesn't matter how much training you have done in Scientology. You thought all that was going to save you? Nope. It was never going to save you from the outsiders. Okay, now we go deep. No doubt you are familiar with the Revelations section of the Bible where various events are predicted. Okay, now we're going to have some commentary on this section. Let's talk about this quickly, both to help clarify what the book of Revelation was and what it was not. L. Ron Hubbard makes a common but fatal mistake when he refers to it as the Revelations section of the Bible, because there are not many revelations. It's one big revelation. And you can find whole articles and essays explaining why that matters. The book of Revelation was likely written around 95 AD on the island of Patmos off the coast of Turkey by someone named John. It's generally agreed upon, even by the most conservative of Christians, that the events described are symbolic rather than meant to be taken literally, and that most of the events can be connected directly to the Roman persecution of Christians at that time. John was someone of authority in the church at that time, and he wrote this work to strengthen the resolve of persecuted Christians. Once you get past the heavy symbolism and fantastic imagery, the message is simply this: no matter how powerful evil may seem now, God is still in control, Christ has already won the decisive victory, and those who stay faithful, even through suffering, will share in his ultimate triumph and eternal life. Well, with classic narcissistic self-absorption, Hubbard ignores the actual origins and meaning of this work and twists it into a Scientology context as follows. Quote, also mentioned, is a brief period of time in which an arch enemy of Christ, referred to as the Antichrist, will reign, and his opinions will have sway. All this makes for very fantastic, entertaining reading, but there is truth in it. This Antichrist represents the forces of Lucifer, literally the light bearer or light bring. Lucifer being a mythical representation of the forces of enlightenment, the Galactic Confederacy. All right, now, not to step on anyone's beliefs, but the terms Antichrist and Lucifer do not appear anywhere in Revelation. Satan certainly does, though, described as the dragon, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan in Revelation 12:9. The dragon tries to devour the woman's child, which is symbolic of Christ, and later makes war on the woman's offspring, which is symbolic of Christian believers. Finally, he is bound for 1,000 years before being thrown into the lake of fire. When Jerome translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, around 400 AD, Lucifer was a term that originally referred to the planet Venus, and it appeared in poetry by Cicero, Virgil, and Ovid to mean the morning star. That's all the word meant. This was later reinterpreted to refer to the prideful fall of Satan, such as in Luke 10:18, quote, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So the name Lucifer for Satan is not originally biblical. It's a product of tradition, poetry, and centuries of connecting these different passages. Do you think Hubbard knew that? I don't. Maybe this is just a semantics argument, but I thought you should know more about these words since Hubbard put so much importance on them. And of course, he does so by connecting Lucifer to the Galactic Confederacy. All right, so what is the Galactic Confederacy? Well, basically, it's the same thing as the Markabian Confederacy, which Hubbard spoke about in a number of different lectures. In a 1963 lecture, he described it as, quote, various planets united into a very vast civilization which has come forward up through the last 200,000 years and is formed out of the fragments of earlier civilizations. In the last 10,000 years, they have gone on with a sort of a decadent, kicked-in-the-head civilization that contains automobiles, business suits, fedora hats, telephones, and spaceships. A civilization which looks almost like an exact duplicate, but is worse off than the current US civilization. Okay, so that's Hubbard's description of it. But despite this kicked-in-the-head decadence, apparently the Markabians are quite good at interstellar travel and have invasion of other planets on their mind. So much so that an unrevealed interpretation of the book of Revelation is that it's code for the Markabian invasion of Earth. Lucifer, the light bringer, according to Hubbard, represents not Satan, the supernatural being, but instead represents the forces of enlightenment, otherwise known as the Markabian invasion force. He goes on to say, my mission could be said to fulfill the biblical promise represented by this brief Antichrist period. During this period, there is a fleeting opportunity for the whole scenario to be effectively derailed, which would make it impossible for the mass Markabian landing, i.e. Second Coming, to take place. The Second Coming is designed, among other things, to trigger a rapid series of destructive events. So this is where Hubbard makes the bold claim that his mission is to stop this Markabian invasion from happening in the first place. He's saying that revelation is not anything like what the Christians believe it's about. Instead, it's code for this invasion, and that the period of the Antichrist's reign is actually a period where Hubbard himself is stepping up and doing his work with Scientology and blocking the Markabians. We have absolutely no idea how he's going to head this off, but I guess he'll just make it go right. Because if this second coming, this Markabian invasion happens, then we're basically done for. He goes on to write, with the exception of the original Buddhism, virtually all religions of any consequence on this planet, monotheistic and pantheistic alike, have been instruments to speed the progress of this evolution of consciousness and bring about the eventual enslavement of mankind. As you know, Siddhartha Gautama never claimed to be anything more than a man. Having caught on to this operation, he postulated his own return as Maitreya, part of which prophecy will have been fulfilled upon the passing of L. Ron Hubbard. I love the way Hubbard just breezily dismisses any religion of any consequence as being part of the trap, except for Buddhism, because, wait for it, Buddha predicted he'd come back, and that prophecy was realized in the birth of L. Ron Hubbard. If you aren't familiar, Hubbard penned a book called The Hymn of Asia, where he literally claimed he was the realization of an ancient Buddhist prophecy. Now, we aren't going there today, but needless to say, Hubbard was lying through his teeth. The way he described Maitreya was a total fantasy of his own invention, and no Buddhist or religious studies scholar or historian would ever take anything Hubbard said about this seriously once they looked up the actual Buddhist writings about this. It was just another story Hubbard told to sell himself to a mainly gullible Western audience, who unfortunately tend to believe almost anything that anyone tells them about mystical Eastern beliefs and practices. Hubbard's ego was truly immeasurable, and he never failed to take an opportunity to feed it with these nonsensical stories that he fed to Scientologists over and over again. All right, let's carry on here. Quote, "For those of you whose Christian toes I may have stepped on, let me take the opportunity to disabuse you of some lovely myths. For instance, the historic Jesus was not nearly the sainted figure he's been made out to be. In addition to being a lover of young boys and men, he was given to uncontrollable bursts of temper and hatred that belied the general message of love, understanding, and other typical Markab PR. You have only to look at the history his teachings inspired to see where it all inevitably leads. It is historic fact, and yet man still clings to the ideal, so deep and insidious is the biologic implanting." All right, now you may have heard that Hubbard had some controversial things to say about Jesus, but turning the human being who was Jesus into a homosexual pedophile is actually pretty typical of how Hubbard thought about his enemies. Hubbard had a rampant streak of homophobia, aided in part by what was very likely an internalized self-loathing about his own homosexual inclinations and behavior as a young man. Some have conjectured over the years that Hubbard may have been sexually assaulted himself as a younger man, but I've never seen any real evidence of that. But it's crystal clear in this student briefing that Hubbard had an intense and deep hatred of Christianity, and this was very likely inspired by his mentor, Aleister Crowley, the man who literally labeled himself the Beast 666. Hubbard desperately wanted to pass his hatred on to all Scientologists, and where he may have dropped hints here and there about how religion was a control operation and the product of brainwashing, this writing takes it way further. So, Hubbard says, it is a good joke that the Galactic Confederacy is associated with the serpent in the garden, the beast, and other emissaries of the Prince of Darkness. Yet, in certain passages and esoteric interpretations of the Bible, much of which has been taken out and effectively suppressed for centuries, as well as the Kabbalah, the truth reveals itself quite nicely for the clever and the ungullible. Okay, first off, I have to guess Hubbard is saying the joke is that it's actually fitting and not ironic that the Galactic Confederacy is symbolically connected with things that are thought of as inherently evil in Christian mythology, since Hubbard believes so too. He made out that the Markabians have been one of the biggest baddies in this sector of the universe and have plagued Earth for a very long time. Next, I believe Hubbard has to be alluding to his Gnostic beliefs when he refers to esoteric interpretations of the Bible, including allusions to entire books and writings that some early Christians considered sacred, but that were eventually left out of the official list of books accepted as scripture. Many of these were later labeled heretical because they contained ideas that aligned more with Gnosticism and alluded to hidden knowledge or beliefs which the Church Fathers considered anti-orthodox to what they wanted Christianity to be. For example, there is the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, many with a mystical or cryptic tone. Gnostic groups loved this text because it emphasized hidden knowledge. Or there's the Gospel of Judas, which suggests that Judas's betrayal was done in obedience to Jesus's request, turning the whole story upside down. And perhaps one of the most heretical of all, the secret book of John, which became a key Gnostic text that tells a radically different creation story, where the Christian God is labeled a flawed demiurge who created the material world but denied mankind access to the truth about the real one true God. And the demiurge pretends to be that God and then subjugates and oppresses people for centuries. In many Gnostic systems, the Christian God is the bad guy of the story. These are the kind of teachings that Hubbard believed he was privy to, which made him ungullible. When he talked about his belief in God in his affirmations, I believe he was referring to the Gnostic creator, who is definitely not the demiurge or the Christian God pretender. Then he drags in Kabbalah, but again displays his ignorance by calling it the Kabbalah, as though it's a book or document. This is a common mistake if Kabbalah is something you're not actually familiar with, and I'm certain Hubbard had no idea what he was talking about here. Put simply, Kabbalah is a form of Jewish mysticism that was formalized in the 12th and 13th century in France and Spain. If you want to refer to its most famous text, that would be called the Zohar. Aleister Crowley's beliefs were heavily influenced by Kabbalah principles, but there's no evidence that Hubbard used anything specifically from Kabbalah in Scientology. There are concepts of spiritual ascension and images such as the Tree of Life and the Sephirot ladder, which show stages of ascension, but this is hardly an original concept or unique to Kabbalah. I honestly believe Hubbard threw this in here just to sound smarter and more learned than he really was, which is kind of a bad habit he had throughout all of his Scientology writings, actually. So let's carry on. So it really is a race against time, and one that we happen to be losing at the moment, as the implant drama inexorably plays itself out in spite of the breakneck pace I've managed to keep up these last 35 years. Okay, now, sorry, but referring to what he was doing with his constant plagiarizing of other people's ideas and saying he was moving at breakneck speed is just too outrageous for me to ignore. Hubbard did the very least most of the time, leaving all the really hard work to his lackeys and underlings. Make no mistake, Hubbard was a lying bastard who only played at being a researcher, philosopher, and religious leader. He didn't take any of these jobs seriously, and he couldn't have come up with an original philosophic idea if he'd had a gun put to his head. Not one thing in all of Dianetics and Scientology is new or different. It was all ripped off from people who were far more creative than Hubbard ever could be. Like Madame Blavatsky, Hubbard just stole from much earlier works and reworked it to make it sound like it was something he came up with. The man was shameless this way. All the way to the end, as we see throughout this document, the only hard work Hubbard did was working to keep his followers completely bamboozled so they would worship at his altar. He continues, I had an inkling, but only that, of the insidiousness of this material as far back as 1945. Okay, one of Hubbard's favorite tricks was to rewrite his own history, which he did often, in order to imbue his followers with a sense of purpose and make them think that he had been working for many lifetimes to achieve his ends. The year 1945 was a bit infamous in Hubbard's life, as that is the time when he was supposedly recovering from his non-existent war wounds and was discharged from the Navy after being on a very long medical leave. The only thing wrong with him were ulcers and pink eye, but Hubbard whined endlessly to the government about how desperately he needed medical attention and a bigger pension. He was unable to write much of anything and was struggling for cash. He abandoned his wife and children, and in August of 1945, he met Jack Parsons, a relationship that would last less than a year before Hubbard swindled Parsons out of thousands of dollars and stole Jack's girlfriend out from under him. So this is the time period when he is now telling his followers he got the first inklings of this insidious material. Perhaps, to Hubbard's twisted way of thinking, that is a version of the truth. After all, 1945 is the year Hubbard would start down a path where magic became the dominating force in his life and belief structure. So sure, this is when he got the first inklings of what would become Scientology. He goes on. Later, in characteristic over-optimism, I thought that R6 would be the end of it. But that was followed by knots and the purification rundown, and still the string continued to unwind with the ball at the end of it just out of sight. It makes one wonder about such things as fate and destiny. Such was the resolve with which I managed to cling to that string, not often knowing how close I was to falling into the abyss myself. Oh, Ron. Always the dramatic savior of mankind who has to suffer the slings and arrows of not only the suppressive people who are conspiring to take your work and use it for dark ends, but you had to make so many personal and dangerous sacrifices along the way. You poor man, what a grand effort you have engaged in, almost falling into the dark abyss so that you could map the narrow path to immortality and freedom for us all, huh? Man, if there was ever anyone who suffered from main character syndrome, it's L. Ron Hubbard. There are very few people I've come across in cultic studies who present a more grand image of themselves than Hubbard. Yet we know the truth of how deluded, self-absorbed, and cowardly this man really was. And that's what makes his delusions of grandeur so obvious and pathetic. Especially when he then says, quote, "But destiny is merely the rationalization of feeble minds. Things don't just happen, they are caused. and causative beings can undo the plans of madmen and would-be enslavers, no matter how long those plans may have been in the making. I'll just quickly note, as a former Scientologist, that what Hubbard claims here, that things don't just happen, that they're always caused, is perhaps one of the most insidiously destructive principles Hubbard teaches. Like Aleister Crowley before him, Hubbard was desperate to gain the power to enact his will over anyone and anything. He believed, like all real magicians do, that magic was the key to manifesting his will, or what he called his intention, and that anything that stopped him or got in his way would put him in the position of effect, which is the opposite of being at cause. If Hubbard had any core obsession, something that really drove his engine, it was this. By passing this on to his followers, he creates in them a narcissism that is almost unmatched in any other cultic system. Because Scientologists are heavily indoctrinated into the idea that they are personally responsible for literally every single thing that ever happens. Not just to them in their own lives, but ultimately across the entire universe. Put another way, they assume the status of God. I really can't underline the importance of what I just said enough, because it is an incredibly stupid and self-destructive idea. The universe is a random place, filled with circumstances that are beyond anyone's control. Just like every single person's life is packed with random events that are not their responsibility. But by convincing Scientologists that they are always in the driver's seat, he imbues in them a kind of delusional psychosis, and also enables his church to be able to blame them for anything that happens to them, no matter what the real cause was. And I don't think that was an accident. So we're now coming down the home stretch of this student briefing, so let's power through the last few paragraphs. I will soon leave this world only to return and complete my mission with another identity. Although I long to stretch my arms back in repose on some distant star in some distant galaxy, it appears that that is one dream that will have to wait. But my return depends on people like you doing these materials thoroughly and completely, so that there will be a genetically uncontaminated body for me to pick up and resume where I left off. A body free of religious mania, right-wrong dichotomy, and synthetic karma. The job ahead is far too tough to even contemplate doing with your standard, courtesy of certain other dimensional players and their Markab pieces, many of whom are right here in the general populace, genetically altered body. If you can connect those weird M dashes there. Now, according to leaked OT VIII materials and testimonials from people who did the level, OT VIII is a solo level, meaning you sit in a room with an e-meter asking yourself these questions, and the questions are along the lines of, locate a time you decided it was safer not to be OT. Or, what false purpose could you have that would prevent you from being OT? Or, what have you done to make yourself less than you are? I mean, this is hardly groundbreaking material here, and people who have done the actual level have been disappointed, to say the least. This is supposed to be the pinnacle of Scientology and the big prize for donating upwards of $1 million to Scientology. So you can understand why I would say that people who get to this level either finally wake up to see Hubbard's fantasies for what they are, or they slip over into a kind of depressed, delusional state where reality ceases to have a whole lot of meaning and the walls of objectivity become a bit thin. Personally, I feel sorry for such people because every one of them wanted so badly to just be free of the binds of life, and by far most of them are well-intentioned people. In the end, that even applies to Tom Cruise. Quote, without the biogenetic meddling of those who stand outside time, who cannot yet directly influence our world and must work through others, the dwindling spiral is not nearly as automatic and self-perpetuating as it appears. Okay, now let's just very carefully ignore what Hubbard just said there about how the outsiders cannot yet directly influence our world. He laid out in some detail just 2 pages back exactly how they did directly influence our world and how they have the power to alter any aspect of our world, even time. This is the kind of double bind that locks up the ability of Scientologists to think for themselves. Hubbard packs Scientology materials with these kinds of contradictions. Quote, there are regions, even in isolated parts of the Milky Way, where poets are free to poet and magicians can paint reality with their magic wands and exteriorize without body kickback. But these areas, unfortunately, are fewer and fewer. I will return not as a religious leader, but a political one. That happens to be the requisite beingness for the task at hand. I will not be known to most of you, my activities misunderstood by many, yet along with your constant effort in the Theta Band, I will effectively postpone and then halt a series of events designed to make happy slaves of us all. So there you have it, the secret that I have kept close to my chest all these years. Now you too are part of this secret, and I no longer have to shoulder the burden alone or live with the possibility of body death before all the data could be released. And with this briefing, I entrust to each of you the responsibility for this material until such time as I am able to return. For we have no help from any other quarter in this matter. The handful of secret societies throughout history that have caught on to this game have long since fallen by the wayside or been taken over and become instruments of the very menace they were set up to combat. It's just down to our little plucky band of ragtag heroes to save everyone, right, Ron? This is another concept that unites Scientologists like nothing else. The Matrix-like theme that runs throughout all of Hubbard's writings, going back to his wacko book, A History of Man, and lectures from 1952, such as The Role of Earth. Here, Hubbard has created a near-perfect enemy, the outsiders. They are literally beyond the reach of anyone in the material world, and they make the psychiatrists and the Markabians look like first graders. Quote, the rundown is long and can be arduous, but it must be done thoroughly if there is to be any effect, not only on the body of the pre-OT, but the body of his or her progeny as well. There is some danger, but with OT VIII thoroughly complete, it is not nearly so great as the danger witnessed by assorted unfortunates who happened to stumble into this area in their sleep or in moments of reverie or snatch, experiencing an hitherto mysterious phenomenon known as spontaneous combustion. I mean, I don't even know what to say to this. People who happen to somehow stumble into this material without preparation spontaneously combust. I mean, dude, I guess it beats getting pneumonia and dying. Caution. Do not be PTS while traversing this third and final wall of fire. But the area is well charted, the rundown many years in secret development, and by the time you read this, undoubtedly completed on myself. The winds waiting you are like none that you have ever experienced, not just for you, but for your children, your children's children, and the whole of mankind, if we succeed. And we will. If we had time, we would pity the many poor souls from 1950 to PT, present time, who choose such an exactly inopportune moment to drop off the road to truth and disconnect from reality, the full burst and glory of OT practically within their grasp. But we haven't the time to wax philosophic or ponder might have beens. The rundown follows. Again, I say, do it thoroughly and completely, for it is your ticket to the stars and beyond. L. Ron Hubbard, founder. So, there you have it. The introduction to the highest and what will likely be the final level of Scientology from this point forward. I personally doubt that David Miscavige will ever compile on his own the next OT levels. For some reason, the church publishes a chart that shows 7 more OT levels above OT VIII. Promises have been made since OT VIII was released in 1988 that the next release will be OT levels 9 and 10. Miscavige has dragged his heels, put it off, ignored the earlier promises, and basically just keeps moving the goalposts to keep that carrot dangling in front of the Scientology whales for literally decades now. It's been 37 years, in fact. There is no indication, none at all, that Miscavige has any idea what to do about this, or that he has any plans to do anything. The Free Winds, the boat that OT VIII's delivered on, has been bumping around in the Mediterranean all this time, giving people this big tease and ripping them off over and over and over again. It routinely takes more time to get set up for and approved to start OT VIII than it does to do the actual level, which apparently only takes a week or two. So now we have bookended both ends of Scientology, from where Hubbard's head was at when he started writing Dianetics to where his head was at when he was near the end. What have we found? Well, as I see it, we have a truly pathetic little man, a cowardly wife and child abuser who was more than happy to watch his followers suffer indignity after indignity while he laughed at them for their stupidity in believing his garbage and junk science. We see an organization that is willing to spend millions of dollars to destroy anyone who gets in its way of bilking billions of dollars from unsuspecting, well-intentioned people. And we see this organization now led by someone who has even less creativity and more violent psychosis than Hubbard himself, in the form of David Miscavige, a runt of a man who we could say overcompensates for his weaknesses by physically and psychologically brutalizing his staff and followers. The only real justice in any of this is that Hubbard died alone and totally insane. He abandoned everyone who ever cared about him, including every one of his family members and closest aides. He was a pathetic loser, and he died in a state of total paranoia, a victim of his own insane beliefs. Miscavige will very likely suffer a similar fate and is well on his way to drinking himself into an early grave if people like Tom DeVach are to be believed. Unlike what you see in the movies, people who live lives of victimizing others are the most miserable people on the planet. They know there's something deeply broken inside themselves. Despite all their money and all their power and influence, not a single one of them can buy happiness or peace of mind. In what might be described as the ultimate plot twist, they die being the effect of their own cause, a phrase Hubbard used to describe people who were just like him. So in that sense, there is a cosmic justice at work. Thanks for watching me go over all this. I hope that this has been informative, educational, and entertaining, and that you've learned something about not just Scientology, but about the propensity of human beings to believe literally anything if it serves their ends or emotional needs, and how dangerous and destructive some of those beliefs can be. And I hope, knowing what you know, you can help end the scourge of Scientology by sharing this work and by letting people know how awful it really is. Cults thrive in ignorance. Let's do what Hubbard couldn't ever get himself to do in any part of his life. Let's reveal the truth. Okay, bye now.